This presentation is entitled A Comprehensive Resource for Mesopotamian Civilization, the 4banks.net project. And I'd like to begin with talking a little bit about the genesis of this project, which is in the need to categorize, record, archive, and publish a large quantity of data from an archaeological dig. So how can we do that in such a way that the data is well collected, well archived by many different people all at the same time and over the span of many years in a database structure where all of the information from these different moments and different people can flow together into one single unified vision of the civilization we're studying. So that's the fundamental question we're trying to solve. By saying that, I already begin to show my cards, show the situation that our central philosophy is that there's a unified whole. The perception of the whole is, in the view of Bucciolati, myself, and our team, the specifically human characteristic that the scholar brings to the field. And there are many other tools that we can use, quantitative and scientific in various ways, technological, as we'll speak about today. But that there's also an irreducible human element that has to do with the perception of the whole. Now, in saying that, I realize that I am taking a stand or we are taking a stand that is controversial, because there is certainly a large part of the machine learning community that thinks that consciousness is simply an emergent phenomenon that comes out from having a lot of data and a lot of connections between elements such as neurons in the brain, and that consciousness is the ability to somehow recursively be aware of those same connections. And that may be the case. I'm not here going to defend one view or the other. I'm just going to say that from our point of view, we start with the idea that what really is typical of the human being in the very dawn of prehistory, so maybe 2 million years ago, what's typical is the perception of structure. Professor Bucciolati has worked on what he calls paraperception, so the hominid capacity to see structure and remember structure, create structure, and transmit it from generation to generation, which we see in early stone tools. Language also obviously shows this capacity. So the philosophy that Bucciolati proposes could be described with two fundamental aspects. One is top-down, and that is this perception of the whole that I just spoke about. The other aspect that we could emphasize is the recursive, iterative feedback process that makes the categories better. So we'll get into this in a moment, but when we're looking at an archaeological dig, the fragments that come to the surface are not necessarily things that we know a priori what they mean or what they're for. So there's an iterative process to propose what a meaning is of each fragment, archive it, categorize it, and then improve that categorization as time goes on. Let me read you a quote from Bucciolati. He says that grammaticality should be the primary goal, not obviously because hermeneutics is secondary in a qualitative sense. It is in fact the final goal. But it depends on what, upstream of it, must be a record understood and structured in a way fully consonant with the unique nature of the data. It is the grammatical structuring that makes reclustering possible, and thus leads in an arguable way to the hermeneutic reading of the evidence. So that's a complex, perhaps, way of saying it, but the point is that the grammar of the categorization of the data that arrives firsthand in the dig is absolutely crucial to the possibility of putting the data together later on into an interpretation. And what we're trying to do with our many data sets that we've integrated and are continuing to integrate is to render each atom of data findable, knowable, and connected to other atoms of data into a large-scale interpretation, but in a transparent manner, so that another scholar can come along and see the atoms connected together in our interpretation and perhaps propose an alternative explanation of the facts. So this leads us also to what will be the conclusion of my presentation, and that is that perhaps the structure of atoms connected together looks like a graph representation, nodes connected by edges, and perhaps a graph database would be a particularly good way to save the data. So we'll get to that later on. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about what we've done so far. The Urkesh Global Record is a website that Bucciolati has been working on since the beginning of his work at Urkesh in Syria, which is several decades ago. The website is structured as a series of digital books. I'm just going to give you a very brief introduction to that by showing you the complexity of the databases that are available. So you can see here that the jars collected in the temple terrace are categorized, are shown with a section of the jars. And these jars are all categorized in the database, and all of the data is available to the reader. Now, one of the fundamental issues in archaeology is that the data is available only once, it can be argued, only in the moment in which it is found in the emplacement of the site. And the moment in which a piece of data is extracted from that emplacement, it no longer is available in its original sense. And so there's a crucial importance to saving all the information that one can of the first moment of observation. Now, that requires a grammar. I'm not going to go into it in detail here, but you can find much more information about it in A Critique of Archaeological Reason, Bucciolati's book of 2017, and also in the Urkesh Global Record website, which is open and available to the public. The 4banks.net project is a development of this underlying archaeological approach applied not only to archaeology and the artifacts that are coming out of DIG, but to the scholarly project writ large. 4banks obviously refers to the name that the Mesopotamians gave to themselves. They didn't think of themselves as the people between the rivers, but as the people who lived along the banks of the two rivers. And so that's the name of our project as well. The collection of websites is held together around a central hub, which is basically an expression of Bucciolati's philosophy of web publication, digital publication. And the main feature of this philosophy that I want to outline and underline is that it has a clear sense of structure that defines it as a recognizable whole. Throughout the websites, Bucciolati insists that our understanding and our publication of the data must be governed by an overall view, and not simply a large piecemeal collection of fragments put together without any beginning or end. So again, you can see that the ontological issue of wholes, the perception of the whole, is also very important here at the level of how we present the data, how we speak about it, and how we write about it. Two recent instances of this theory in practice. Well, first of all, the Critique of Archaeological Reason book is accompanied by a website, and the website is open to the public at critiqueofar.net. The website basically takes the form of a bibliography, a very large bibliography, and a lot of footnotes. So the printed book doesn't contain these details, but the website is a very large network of information that led to the book and that discusses the topics in it. It also has other features like small monographic articles, book reviews, and excerpts from some of the more important studies on the issues. So all of that is publicly available. You can see how that has been done. I am now working on the Mesopotamian Religion website, and in this section we're continuing the same kind of framework as was done in the methodological website on the critique, and that we will continue in the politics website, which has work has begun on that. There's a book also on the grammar, Babylonian grammar, and that book is published, and the website is underway with about 300 works in the bibliography. Shortly, we will also publish a book on literature and another one on art. So with these 5 books, the Mesopotamian civilization will be somewhat fully described in the terms that Bucciolati would like to propose. Now that core narrative, which is the center of what we're doing right now, is not the only narrative, obviously, and it's also not the only narrative that we will contain on our websites. As we go, the critique website is already starting to host a second core narrative written by another scholar, and the same will be true of the others in the future. So that raises the question of collaboration. How do we integrate differing points of view within what we hope will be one unified vision of the civilization? How is that possible? The central core narrative implies a sort of authority, but how can we get beyond the pyramidal structure of an authority and create several multilinear discourses that share with each other the data that comes out of the ground and that speak with each other rather than simply one excluding the others? This is the point of creating a digital discourse that has a multilinear character. In practice, as you can see in this image, Bucciolati's paradigm looks like several linear discourses together, but in order to fully understand A in this discourse, you have to also know about discourse B. So if you look at the way that the logical succession of arguments goes in stream A, it contains lowercase a, b, and then to get C and D you have to go up to a different discourse. And so a first example of that is in the history of the discipline part of the website, where it's like an encyclopedia article giving an overall view of Mesopotamian religious studies. And you can see that the article talks about, for example, Leo Oppenheim's admission of ignorance, that we shouldn't write about Mesopotamian religion. And the multilinear character allows us to then link to an excerpt in which Oppenheim's statement is directly available. And then to get back to the point of departure and continue in that main line of discourse A, we can just close the tab and come back to the article as before. That's a very simple example, familiar to nearly anyone, but the point here is that the discourse has several different layers, and they're all necessary for a complete understanding of it, even though only some of them are present in the simple linear discourse published as the article History of the Discipline. We can also see another example a little bit richer here. So we're referencing Otto's The Idea of the Holy. The full text is available. There's an excerpt from Jacobson about the point of intransitivity, and there's an entire article about intransitivity as a metaphor, which is important for both Jacobson and Bucciolati. So it's a typical issue of hyperlinking and a discourse that, however, in order to be completely understood, requires reading the other things that are on the page. A second example is to annotate the core narrative itself. Now, since it's a written book, that isn't possible directly, at least not in a way that would be shared with other people. So we've developed small summaries of each chapter in that core narrative book, and these can be annotated using an online tool called Hypothesis, where you can click and drag to underline and highlight text, and even write notes about those pieces. And so it's possible to comment it and add hyperlinks. So in this case, after the web page is finished, we can add a link to enrich the discourse. Now that possibility, which is wonderful, leads us immediately in a problematic direction, which is that those hyperlinks can quickly become wandering. So how can we avoid that problem? Well, it's not an easy problem to avoid, because there's a combinatorics problem, first of all. That the more links you have, the more possible paths there are. But not just the more, but they change as the factorial of the number of links. So very quickly, you're well beyond what a human brain can manage within itself. Now, a single author writing a text is able to manage several data sets and footnote to them, maybe even thousands of sources. But that's possible because the single author is working off of one linear narrative. How do you handle that when there are more than one linear narrative, more than one data set, enormous data sets that one cannot entirely manage within one's mind? That is the problem we're trying to face. So one way that we're doing that, and that I'd like to talk about here, is maybe we could call it computer-aided humanism. We have an automatically generated linear index in the websites that I showed you. So each piece of bibliographic information is inserted together with codes that allow the computer to automatically generate an index. It's a keyword-based index, so it's very simple, old school, but it works pretty well. But are there other ways that we could structure the data at the ground level of the database to permit this sort of computer-aided humanism? Well, one example is the multinodal index that I realized together with Blevmore Labs. As you can see in this image, this is a map, a graph, force-directed graph representation of a map of keywords in each of the texts in our bibliography. So here I'm looking up the word ritual, and you have a cluster of works that deal with ritual. An interesting feature of this map is that one node, very large, references a book by Ian Hodder. It's his 2010 book. And that node is connected also to 5 other nodes that aren't connected to anything else. So that leads us to be curious, well, what is this subgroup? Well, it turns out that the subgroup is all works by Catholic authors, such as Benedict XVI, Ratzinger, and John Paul II. And so their treatment of ritual is very different from the others in the database that talk more about Mesopotamian religion. We also have another different kind of multinodal index, which is a comparison of the authors in the database based on what we could call a keyword space. And so it's a two-dimensional projection of all the keywords in the database. You can compare 2 authors across and say, for example, in this instance, that Assmann and Cohen, well, Cohen seems to cluster in one area that Assmann has never dealt with at all. It would be interesting to go and hover over those nodes and see what those words are. Or, for example, we can see that monotheism is dealt with by Assmann, not by Cohen, at least within the books that are in our bibliography. So it gives us a first stage heuristic to see which authors cover the space more than others, and also to see some interesting connections of which words are particular to only one author and not both. These tools are suggestive of possibilities, but they aren't really mature yet. So the last thing that I want to bring to your attention here, and I think this is where the database integration question becomes most fruitful, is if there's another way that we can do this, and that's the graph database idea that I alluded to at the beginning. Could a graph representation of our complex interrelated data augment our ability to manage it in an atomistic way and also in a large-scale unified reading of history way? Is that possible? Well, it is really an exciting fact that OCHR, the database system developed at the University of Chicago, is thought through exactly using a graph database system. So I'm very interested to hear more about that and understand more what research has been done there. In our system, we're working on tools such as recommendation engines based on the connections between the information that we have put into our database, in order for new researchers who haven't read everything that's in the database to be able to access information and be surprised by connections that they didn't think of because they couldn't think of, but the computer can suggest them to take a look at this or that other thing. It is also possible to generate a semantic web. Now, this is perhaps science fiction at this point, but maybe not entirely, because it is possible to save relations of logical characters such as agrees with or disagrees with within the database. So, for example, Mark Smith disagrees with Bucciolati's view on certain aspects of the origins of monotheism. And if that data is saved into the database, especially in a graph format, it can be the source of new considerations further on down the road. So these are 2 ways that we're also using graph databases to try to integrate together with what we already have, a publication tool that can grow in time and become more and more useful as it is used. Thank you for your attention.